You're watching Capital Cosm. My name is Danny. It is January 9th, 2026. And do not adjust your mobile screen, your television screen, laptop screen, whatever you're using to watch this episode, because we've got two of the biggest heavy hitters on the FinTwit geopolitical space. It is Professor Jiang from Predictive History and Simon Dixon from, he's a Bitcoin OG investor, as well as he has his own YouTube channel as well, Simon Dixon as well. So, gents, I know you're heavily respected in your respected fields. And, with the way things are happening right now, it seems like we're witnessing a change in the world order. And the last time I interviewed you, Professor Jiang, you had your own idea on where the trajectory was heading. You posited the notion that we were heading into a Pax Judeaica world, transitioning from Pax Americana to Pax Judeaica. Simon, you had a bit of a different take. You actually see Israel being treated as a toxic asset and eventually leading to a GCC-led Middle East. So I want to kind of reconcile some of the differences here and kind of get your takes on how you view one another's thesis. But we'll start off with you, Professor Jiang. For those who may have not watched our last episode or or have just not been introduced to your work on Pax Judeaica, just a brief overview on your Pax Judeaica thesis.
Right. So as people know, there's a war approaching between Israel and Iran, which will probably involve the United States. So Netanyahu visited Mar-a-Lago a week ago, and suddenly you have these protests all over Iran, and they're escalating. And Trump has said that he will defend the rights of these protesters, and he will promote democracy in Iran. So it seems as though we're heading towards a showdown in Iran. And if Iran falls, then my argument is that what will emerge in the Middle East is Pax Judeaica, where Israel will become the nexus, the focal point of power in the Middle East. It will be powered by its technology, its surveillance state, its access to transnational capital, and its control of trade routes. The Levant really is the center of global trade. And so if you're Russia, you want to access the African market, you have to access it through Israel. If you're China and you want to access oil in the Middle East, you have to do it so through Pax Judeaica. And Pax Judeaica will be responsible for rebuilding Libya, Syria, Egypt, Iraq. And so this is really a fulfillment of biblical prophecy or the Greater Israel Project. So that's my grand thesis of what will happen next 10, 20 years.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Jiang. Simon, if you don't mind giving us your version of what comes after Pax Americana and how you see things unfolding in the Middle East.
Yeah, so I follow financial flows, and then financial flows are allowed to access strategic choke points and resolve strategic choke points and give you access to technology as well. And so I come to a slightly different conclusion in that when I think about American power, I think of America as a country that is subordinate to its bondholders because it's in a massive debt crisis. And they're using that debt in order to prop up the stock market, which gives more power to corporate interests. So effectively, America has no sovereign power left. It is fully co-opted by corporate interest. And when you look at that corporate interest, you can split, there's more, but you can split it into 3 or 4 very powerful factions. One is military, which used to dominate American foreign policy, but military became public companies and became subordinate to financial power because it needed access to capital and Pentagon budgets. And so the military industrial complex became subordinate later to the financial industrial complex, which gave rise to the technical industrial complex, where algorithm and everything and access to data became more important. But still, the technical industrial complex is subordinate to the financial industrial complex because it needs access to capital. And so that's what I think of America. Now, when I see Israel as representing Western interest as a money laundering organization to test illegal technology and destabilize the Middle East. But the money ultimately always comes back to Western corporate interest. So it represents Google and Microsoft and the main Palantir and various other giants that host themselves on the US stock market. So historically, the strategic goal of America propping up their global hegemon was to always allow for no unification across the Middle East, so that there could be an Arab League and a Persian unification around oil resources. And they executed that using Israel, Turkey, Iran, and Qatar, where they would essentially, through covert operations, proxies that were on opposite sides, and build military bases in each of the respective regions, but then use Iran as a boogie monster to have strategic tension between Iran and Israel that caused all the problems and all the wars. That funneled off trillions of dollars of profits that propped up the dollar. Basically, now what has changed right now is a rising power has risen to close to military supremacy, financial supremacy, and technical supremacy, which is China. And so now America, where we find ourselves today, is they are energy and oil exporters that compete with the Middle East. And China is the manufacturing base of most of the world. And so Chinese money purchases oil off Middle Eastern countries and other regions as well, which funds Gulf sovereign wealth. And Gulf sovereign wealth has made a partnership with Western power. And that Western power is not the military industrial complex, it's the financial industrial complex. And so when you look at the faction of power around the world today, you have a Chinese manufacturing base and Chinese money that can strategically weaken its currency in order to dominate. You have Gulf sovereign wealth, and you have Western financial industrial complex. Now, we are made to look like everyone's at war with each other, but actually they are unified more than we have ever seen in terms of resolving the world and splitting it up into pieces. Now, at the very same time, America right now has done the same operation on Israel. So Israel is nationalizing its country, which means that it's burdening itself through debt through these wars, and then privatizing all of its interest into Gulf sovereign wealth funds and the Western financial industrial complex, propped up by Chinese money and the Chinese manufacturing base, which means that effectively the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds have managed to negotiate leverage by partnering with the Western financial industrial complex. And their goal is that Palestine will have a state. It will be subordinate to the GCC. And Israel is being strategically acquired and burdened with debt. However, it is now leveraging what resources it has, which is its intelligence and its technology, to be useful to the financial industrial complex. So what we get right now is optics that makes it look like the world is moving to World War III, when there's massive coordination and resolution of all strategic points in the world, a movement to multipolarity, and a changing role of Israel from a destabilization to being co-opted by the banks to provide regional stability so that they can make money out of the Middle East, while Western financial powers diversify over to China, the Middle East, and the global South.
Excellent. Well, I'll let Professor Jiang respond to anything that he'd like to on that front, but I'd also like to pose a question for you, Professor Jiang. When Simon mentions a GCC-controlled Middle East, or transitioning away from an Israeli-dominated Middle East to a GCC-controlled Middle East, does it really matter if it's GCC or Israel? If Israel controls or has huge influence on the GCC, Israel doesn't need to conquer the lands physically of the Gulf countries. It could just, have just undue influence within those confines. It sounds like, I guess what I'm really trying to ask is, doesn't Israel have influence within the GCC, or do you see it in light of what Simon just alluded to, that the GCC could be breaking away? Or are there signs that the GCC is breaking away from Israel? Yeah. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I've always understood that if Pax Judeaica were to come into being, then Israel would be the hegemon, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE would play would be partners to Pax Judeaica, and that's how I would perceive it. So first of all, I'm uncertain what GCC really is, because as you know, Saudi Arabia and UAE have had some military conflicts these past few days. And I'm really uncertain how GCC would organize itself. Would it be like a commonwealth, or would it be a hegemon? Because Saudi Arabia would see itself as really the leader of the GCC. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think we move into a collective sovereignty where people have different skills. And so imagine an Israel that is no longer backed by Pentagon budgets to destabilize the region, and instead is utilized for its technology. And then, as we have seen, technology becomes subordinate to financial capital. And so the Gulf countries are essentially, they've been unifying and playing different roles. This is very apparent in Yemen right now. So UAE, which is a part of Abraham Accords, and Saudi Arabia that has said we won't join until Palestine is recognized as a state and we have a two-state solution. They get to play good cop, bad cop. And so UAE in this equation, the wars are essentially, the military is dumping Israel by burdening it with massive debt. And its debt to GDP is going up and up and up. Its stocks are going up and up and up, which is privatization of the resources. And then they're being acquired by the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund, playing bad cop and making it look like they lick the boots of Israel, while Saudi Arabia is playing good cop, and the Western media is making it out like Israel rules the world. And so when you have, for example, making AIPAC look more powerful than the military lobby, financial lobby, insurance lobby, technical lobby, AIPAC's like the 15th number, in terms of money lobby. But when you make it look like Jewish American billionaires within America, they utilize AIPAC to fulfill their financial interest. And by making AIPAC look like it rules the world, you get these great narratives. As America is a falling empire, they get to say, we would never do a genocide. It's just those Jews, and you get to blame shift everything on Israel. And don't get me wrong, what Israel is doing is fundamentally evil. I'm very against it. But I'm looking at where the money and whose interest they're actually serving. And so the Gulf countries have built alternative payment rails. They've reduced the petrodollar to the petro-yuan, about 70-30 right now. China have built with Iran and Russia these rails that are kind of like a credit system where you can sell goods without avoiding sanctions. Saudi sovereign wealth funds have been buying like refiners in Texas. They've been buying, the many strategic partnerships. And so through their sovereign wealth funds, they're effectively acquiring what they need to run a collective sovereignty. And then they're unifying with Turkey and Egypt, which are providing military capacity. And then eventually, as they join this unification, they have a collective power where no one controls everything, but they're all unified around technical and financial rails that the Gulf has essentially built out.
Okay, so I have certain questions. My first question is, what is the coordinating mechanism? What I mean by that is that traditionally, how these sovereignties are run is usually there's a leader, a king, or maybe there's a religion, or maybe there's a common enemy. So my first big question is, what would be the coordinating mechanism of the GCC? Or another way of saying this is, what are they trying to achieve?
Financial unification, where their historical partner stroke enemy, Western imperialism and Russian imperialism, are all unified, because you've got the real powers, which is US, which isn't a sovereign state, so you've got corporate interest. Then you've got China, then you've got Russia, these are the real powers that are calling shots. Now, they've partnered with Gulf sovereign wealth because they control factions of the petrodollar, because Saudi is able to produce a barrel of oil for $5 to $10. America needs the price of oil to be above $40 to $50 to be able to remain, not end up having all of their companies go bust and sold to sovereign wealth. And so the only thing that keeps them unified is their common interest, which I think the financial industrial complex, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and Chinese money have made it where all of their investments perform well because of this collective flow of funds, rather than now each individual country gets to have their own narrative, their own religion, their own leadership. And I believe even right now, Iran is on board with this vision. They've got their own internal issues due to economic warfare. But I believe that any war, and the 12-day war, was to take out the IRGC members as an inside job that needed in order to move towards this new collective vision. And all the proxies are being dumped right now, where they either unify, get eliminated, and essentially Israel is being, if you look at what America and Israel has now become, they have become the military for this unification of financial interest. They can go and take Venezuelan oil, but the profits flow through Chinese infrastructure, Gulf sovereign wealth, and Western financial banking interests.
Okay, all right, so I understand. And so let me use a historical analogy to see if I truly understand what you're saying, okay? So 1688 is the Glorious Revolution, and that creates the Bank of England, the City of London, Transnational Capital, which runs the world today. So why was the Bank of England created? Well, because you have all these warring parties in Europe, the Habsburgs, the Catholic Church, the Dutch Republic, and their leaderships needed to keep their wealth safe, right? Especially the Dutch East Indies Company, the VOC. So the Dutch and the English came to an agreement where this wealth would be transferred to England for safekeeping. And this created the Bank of England, 1694. And this ultimately led to the creation of the British Empire. So so is that what GCC will be, where transnational capital, because of all these wars going on, because of all this instability in America, in Russia, and China, transnational capital is looking for a new host that would be safe, and that would be far away from all these wars, and they would establish a new entity in the GCC. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, so even if you look at the British Empire, what was the British Empire, as you said? It was the private interest, which was the British East India Company. It was the government, which is you enslave it through debt until it's bankrupt, and the Bank of England, which was the privatization of the resources and mercantilism, where you steal all the world's real money through printed money. And so you take the gold from India, you take China's silver through opium wars. But in the end, they end up with the hard assets, and the corporate interest ends up with all of the stock assets, and the government just becomes the piggy bank. They repeated that exercise with the US. The government is the piggy bank. Yep. BlackRock and Transnational Capital and State Street and Vanguard are the British East India Company, ending up with all the assets. And the Federal Reserve is owned by the banks, and now the banks are owned by the money managers as well. So you've got this stateless transnational capital, which I think it's always been. We've just had the illusion of nationalism previously, which was just a utility of building an army under the guise of religion or religion or or army. So now you've got this new transnational financial capital, and that they essentially call the shots, and they're deciding which zones are going to be the war zones. Middle East, they have regional stability. China is going to have its growth story and manufacturing base, and America is going to be civil unrest, and Europe is going to be sacrificed as a war zone. And so military are moving from the Middle East over to Europe, and financial capital has got a new partner, which is China, the Gulf countries, and America just has its capital markets and use its military industrial complex, technical industrial complex, and financial industrial complex. But it's transnational, it's superseding borders.
Okay, I understand. Okay, so it seems to me our disagreement is this. You think that they will relocate to the GCC, whereas I think transnational capital will center itself in Jerusalem. So let me explain to you why I think Jerusalem makes more sense for transnational capital than the GCC. First of all, Israel, the state of Israel, has a wide network of Jewish diaspora, right? So the Jewish diaspora everywhere. And you look at the presidents of Mexico, of a lot of places, they're Jewish. So if Israel were to become Pax Judeaica, you could leverage this wide Jewish diaspora to your benefit. That's number one. Number two is Mossad. Mossad is the most effective intelligence agency in the world. So in today's world, if there's anyone who opposes you, you don't have to go and start a war. You can use target assassinations. You can use blackmail. You can use surveillance, and that's what Mossad is very, very good at. That's point number two. Point number three is Israel is the only country in the Middle East which has nuclear weapons. The GCC does not have nuclear weapons. That's a huge advantage for Israel, and that's what keeps Israel safe. Israel has a central option where if it ever feels threatened, then it nukes the world, not its enemies, but the entire world. So that's a huge advantage for Israel, and I don't think the GCC could ever compensate for that. Number four is that Israel has tremendous human capital. Israel is one of the most well-educated societies in the world. Where would you find the human capital in the GCC? Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Qatar imports most of its human capital. So what if I'm transnational capital? Why would I go to the GCC and establish all this knowledge infrastructure that I would need to run my enterprise when I could just go to Israel, which has all this human capital? Some of the best universities in the world are based in Israel. And then the other element that I think is very important is the eschatological element, where you have a lot of the secret societies, the Freemasons, the Jesuits, the 17 Frankists, who believe that Jerusalem will be where the new world government will be based. So I solve a lot of problems if I base all my transnational capital in Jerusalem. So why would I? So I don't understand what the advantage of the GCC would be over Jerusalem.
Yeah, so if you look at what's happening right now is BlackRock via Saudi Aramco has a board seat on, one of the executives is now a board member of BlackRock. BlackRock is setting up their office in Saudi Arabia. You've got many of the banks that are relocating. China just did, Saudi Arabia just did their bond offering with China. It was denominated in dollars, but it was done via Saudi investment banks. And China also did a bond offering. So all of these alternative payment rails and alternative financial rails are being built. So what's actually effectively happening is you've got Western financial interest that is unifying with this Gulf capital. Now, in terms of the nuclear power. So here's what I think. So there's a tiny Israeli sovereign wealth fund. Now its assets are being utilized by this financial industrial complex. But none of the value of what Israel's building is being maintained to keep Israel sovereign. And so it is just like America, just becoming a tool and a utility for greater financial power. And that greater financial power is not consolidated around just Jewish power. If you look at global wealth right now, the last study that was done, and you can question the data, about 55% of global wealth was affiliated with people that call themselves Christians, 36% atheist, which obviously accounts for the rise of China. And then you've got about 6 to 8% Muslim, and I think about 6% Hindu with the rise of the Gulf countries and the rise of China, India. And then it's about 1 to 2% of known Jewish wealth. Now, is that correct? I don't know. There's all of these, trust company structures that could make that data fairly inaccurate. But I do believe all Israel had will be integrated into this GCC and this Abraham Accords union that is being built. And that is, and so all of those tools, which we even saw, for example, Israel had that $35 billion energy agreement with Egypt. Now that creates a dependency upon Egyptian revenue when America's no longer going to be funding some of that revenue. It will be integrated into these rails. And so I don't see it becoming. Now, the nuclear question is a very good question. My personal belief, and I can't prove this, and it's just a theory, is that obviously the way that nukes were, the nukes were achieved by Israel with the assassination of JFK and the taking over of NUMEC and the creation of the deep state when Mossad and CIA became more integrated. But my personal belief is that Israel is a rep of the US military-industrial complex. The US military-industrial complex controls the deep state, but they are also subordinate to this financial industrial complex. And so my guess is that Israeli nukes would still have key dependencies upon the same type of infrastructure that runs the US nuclear program as well. Can't prove that, it's just a theory. But I don't think Israel is as sovereign and as powerful as we are led to believe.
Okay, so let's focus on Saudi Arabia. I'm Transnational Capital. I have $200 that I want to invest, okay? But Saudi Arabia has something called a line, and I'm not sure what the budget was, $1 trillion or something like that, okay? Which was this like linear city in the desert. So if I'm Transnational Capital, I'm a pretty smart guy. I'm gonna ask some questions. My first question is, why would they come up? Why would they have these ideas? Like what is the rationale for the line? That's number one. Number two is, how does this thing get approved? Is there no process in which architects and experts can tell the leadership of Saudi Arabia the line is absolutely insane? Don't do it. Are there no checks and balances in Saudi Arabia? That's number two. Number three is, if you're an investor in the line and they cancel the project, how can you get your money back? I mean, I'm not an investor, but I'm just saying, if I have $200, I would want to know these questions. How do these projects get approved in Saudi Arabia? How are these projects conceived? And what happens if these projects go sideways, as what has happened with the line?
Sorry, did you say line? I didn't hear that.
The line, yeah. I think it's called Neom, the line. Okay.
I'm not too familiar with that particular piece, and I'm not too familiar with... but my guess is that, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund has had Western consultation. They do this via an investment committee, but obviously it's a centralized power structure, which is why they're able to make strategic investments that make sense for their unification around these hostile powers. And then they've unified with other Gulf sovereign wealth as well. But yeah, I don't necessarily have the answers of how investment decisions are made, but they have had lots of Western consultation. So but it's a centralized power structure.
Please look at this, okay? The line, okay?
Yeah.
It's a straight line.
I have it here on screen, Simon.
Yeah, running across Saudi Arabia. Who came up with this idea? It's utterly insane.
Oh, right. This is the large building, yeah? Yeah.
It's
No,
utterly
it's literally a line.
it is literally a line.
It's literally a line. It's supposed to be like a city within a line in the middle of nowhere in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. I have no idea. Is the answer to that? But what's the wider point here? Is that you think they made bad investment
They've already
decisions?
spent billions of dollars on this thing, okay, and it's going nowhere.
Yeah. Well, one answer to that is, I guess you could say, what is their projection of power? Their projection of power is the ability to show how much financial firing power they have. So you have a massive PR blitz around these crazy and failed projects. And maybe they were never meant to happen. Maybe they were meant to be abandoned. I've got no idea. Maybe they've made bad decisions in the past. I'm not really here to shill for Saudi Arabia's investment decisions.
Let's look at another example where they spent about $1 billion on bringing Ronaldo to Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah.
And the stadiums are empty.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, if I'm Transnational Capital, you know, and I have billions of dollars, why would I invest in GCC when they do this sort of stuff?
Well, they're not investing in GCC. Basically, what's happened is you've got the ability to raise capital, which is Western financial markets and capital markets. And every single deal that geopolitically and strategically is happening right now, including the acquisition of all the key artificial intelligence technology, all of the fundraisers, every single major investment that's happening, all the IPOs that are happening this year, whether it's XIA, whether it's SpaceX, all of them have Gulf sovereign wealth funds in every single transaction. So clearly, BlackRock and the financial industrial complex have decided that collectively they're going to be aligning financial interest with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. And that has provided a conduit between Chinese money, which is the partnerships that Saudi's doing with China, and they're sat in the middle as they build out all these alternative payment rails and various other things. So I think real power, and I'm not saying the Gulf is the power, I'm saying real power, China, which to some degree Russia has become dependent upon, and US, which is Western financial power, they've decided that the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and the Middle Eastern corridors and the energy that's needed for all of these artificial intelligence projects, that the Middle East is going to be included in that. And they get to set the price of oil to a greater degree, while China has built massive reserves. But they've been utilizing all of these different conflicts in order to acquire it cheaper. And then America has now become an energy exporter, but they can't compete with the Middle East in terms of the cost base if they need to combat inflation by pushing down the price of oil, which seems to be one of the strategies. Like, you know, inflation in America is being tackled by replacing jobs with AI and robotics, charging more tax through tariffs, which takes money out of the money supply. And also getting down the price of oil, which bankrupts many of the Western oil producers that can't produce at those cost base. So inflation is being, you know, clearly controlled. But again, it's sovereign China, sovereign wealth in the Middle East, and then Western financial industrial complex. That's every transaction you'll see right now is being invested through that rail.
Right. So my question then is, fine, if the GCC writes all the checks, that's great. But that doesn't really conflict with Pax Judeaica, where the capital is Jerusalem. All decisions are made out of Jerusalem. And the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, they're just investors in this enterprise, and they can get really good returns. I mean, is there a conflict here where Jerusalem is the capital, where Pax Judeaica is really the control center, but the GCC are just the primary investors in this enterprise?
Yeah, because the way I view it, and my opinion is worth a dime a dozen, but the way I view it is that anytime you have like these airstrike spats between Iran and Israel, it's always the GCC countries coming in to intercept Iran's missiles, but never Israel's missiles. It seems like there is like some sort of coalition around Israel, to the point where they're effectively just vassal states for Israel. No, I mean, so if it, and I don't think this conflicts with your thesis either, Simon, because it's effectively saying that, like Professor Jiang just said, they would just be like the financial wing of the broader Pax Judeaica vision in the Middle East. I mean, they would still have their sovereignty and everything, but they would be largely controlled by Jerusalem.
So firstly, I don't think that the Western framing of that they're subordinate to Israel is the correct framing. Israel represents military interests and now financial interests of American power. And so they are subordinate to originally military power from the West and now financial power from the West, because BlackRock and the Western powers managed $30 trillion of assets. The Gulf countries manage $5 trillion of assets. That started as complete subordination through 50-50 partnerships. Over time, they managed to maintain some of that wealth. And so, through they're not subordinate to Israel because Israel represents Western imperial power. And so the technology, for example, they only do the illegal, blatant stuff they couldn't do in America via Israel, and then it gets acquired into the Western capital markets. The value doesn't maintain as Israel as a sovereign state. There's many Israeli billionaires that get to benefit from it. There's Gulf sovereign wealth funds that get to benefit from it. And the key dependency is obviously all the strategic choke points as well. But what I'm saying is that Jerusalem being the capital, fine, that can totally work out. But in terms of Israel as a jurisdiction, maintaining all the power as the new power of the world, I don't think it's an accurate representation of the collective sovereignty that is needed across the region, with Israel being a small country with a small population that is incurring higher and higher level of debt, privatizing more and more of its assets, and being gobbled up by Western and Middle Eastern financial powers.
All right, quick break here, because if you're buying gold or silver the normal way, you're probably overpaying by a lot. And that's because most retail dealers quietly tack on these huge markups, sometimes 10%, sometimes 20%, sometimes even 30%. And you don't even notice it. It's like paying $115 for a $100 bill. Doesn't make sense, right? So that's why I've been using the Bullion Standard Pro. It's a membership that basically lets you buy precious metals at real wholesale prices. The same prices that dealers get. So no inflated premiums, no middleman games. Their platform updates every 5 seconds, straight from mints and distributors. So what you see is literally the real market. And here's the crazy part. If you buy something like this gold American Eagle, here's the amount of money you're going to be saving at the time of this recording, at least. So it basically pays for itself multiple folds on many occasions, depending on what you buy. And to try it out, they're hooking up my viewers with an exclusive 10% off their first month. Just use promo code COSM10 at checkout. That's COSM10 at checkout. So if you're stacking, investing, or just tired of getting hit with hidden markups, check them out now. Bullion Standard Pro. Click on the link down below in the description box and use promo code COSM10. Now let's get back to the video. Interesting. Well, Simon, since we're on the topic of GCC, I want to get your thoughts on what's going on with this conflict between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Catch us up to speed as to what's going on and how this plays to your thesis.
Yeah, what I think we're witnessing right now is the optics of we're about to go to regional war and World War III, when the reality is that there are different powers that are unifying more than we've ever seen, and everyone's resolving all their territorial disputes. So if you look at Syria right now, Gilani, ex-ISIS, he was installed by Turkey and the GCC. And immediately he gets an invite to go to the White House with the Trump administration. Right after the meeting, Trump goes and meets with all the banks and financial institutions. And then they start constructing the 50-year land deals and various other things in order to lift sanctions. And so there is a negotiation between Western financial powers and the region that is using their relative areas of strength. And at the moment, the big change right now is historically the West has used Turkey, Iran, and Qatar to fund to fund proxies to destabilize the region. And then obviously Israel and Iran enemy is the narrative. What we're seeing right now is I think Iran has stepped back. They've abandoned the proxies. Qatar was the one that was funding Hamas for the last 10 years. Qatar is an ally of America with the largest Western base. And so the proxies right now are gaining territory for various factions of power, which is Turkey, which is the Gulf countries, which is Western financial interest. And everyone in a coordinated fashion, just like I think Venezuela was coordinated with Chinese powers, Russian powers, American powers, and various other factions of power. They're all being resolved one by one. So all of the proxies right now, they either integrate, get eliminated, or they serve the interest that they've been paid to serve at the moment. And so in the case of Yemen, you've got the Houthis, which have historically been funded via Iran. You then got Saudi and UAE that had interest. And Saudi and UAE, they historically pay good cop, bad cop. And so what I think we're witnessing is just like the 12-day war, we're getting a bit of theater where Saudi will end up the main power over Yemen. And then at the same time, you had Israel recognizing Somaliland. Somaliland is dominated by UAE investment. And so in that particular case, Israel recognizing it supported UAE interests at the same time as Yemen escalating. And then at the same time, Turkey, which is mainly representing many of the Syrian interest, as well as the Israel and Kurds that represent Western financial powers, big oil and various other interests. Turkey got Somalia. At the same time, in the West, you had all this controversy with Somalia and the scam being revealed. And so all this to say is that Turkey's interest in Somalia, UAE's interest in Somaliland, Saudi Arabian interest in Yemen, Iran is engaging in, I believe, shedding some of its IRGC hardliners, and all of the proxies are being eliminated and integrated because the Gulf countries and the Western financial industrial complex, the Western are using Israel, gain as much land as possible, give us as much leverage, so that when we're negotiating Syria, we're negotiating Yemen, we're negotiating Lebanon, we have as much power as possible to get the best terms. And all of the regions are being divvied up. Now, the Middle East, the strategy is regional stability because essentially China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So you're getting the shedding of all the proxies.
Professor Jiang, I want to ask you a similar question as well. Where do you see the fate of the Middle East heading, at least in the immediate term? It looks like things are coming to a head pretty soon between Iran and Israel. The internet went out yesterday. The phone lines have been cut off in the protests. I don't know what to make of these protests. I don't know how legit they are. We're in the fog of war. It's all PSYOP, and I'm sure there's CIA and Mossad, deeply embedded within these protests, as they found using Starlink and so forth. But do you see this as the grand finale between the Israeli-Iranian conflict here? Is this coming to a head here pretty soon?
So what we're seeing in Iran is a classic color revolution playbook, right? Where you flood the information space, you control the information space, where you infiltrate Iran, you co-opt criminal networks, ethnic minorities, as many different groups as possible, You embed Mossad agents. There are Mossad agents on the ground right now. There are U.S. special forces on the ground right now because we know this because police officers are being shot. Iranian police officers are being shot. But the last step to the color revolution, which is most pivotal, is your capacity to co-opt the security services, right? So in Nepal, the security services were bribed and they sort of just disappeared. So that's the question. How loyal is the Revolutionary Guard Corps to the regime? And I think they're very loyal. So I think at the end of the day, there'll be a lot of bloodshed. Israel might intervene with aerial campaigns, but the regime will still stand. So the big question is, what's going to happen in Iran? If Simon's theory is correct, and I think what will happen is that, as Simon points out, these factions that are opposed to the rise of the GCC, they will be eliminated and leaving behind a regime that is very much cooperative. So, but if the war becomes very nasty and it draws in U.S. ground troops, then the entire Middle East could be on fire, right? Because at the end of the day, the GCC is just an oil field that, and Iran has basically developed its arsenal to destroy the GCC. It has drones, it has ballistic missiles, it has proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah that are still standing. And if the GCC were to enter in a conflict with Iran, then Iran could very quickly wipe out the GCC. So I'm not sure how much of this is theater, how much of this is coordinated. Because if things go sideways, then Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar could find themselves in a lot of trouble.
And another thing is that China just lost Venezuela as a source for oil. Now they've shifted some of their exports from Venezuela to Iran. Should they lose Iran, that would be pretty Trump did signal that he would allow China to buy oil from Venezuela, but it would have to be in USDs. But still, nonetheless, losing a source like Venezuela and then Iran, who were supplying it a good deal of oil, wouldn't that be a big deal for them, for China?
Look, both Russia and China cannot afford to lose Iran. If Iran would be lost and the Russia's southern flank would open up, Russia could not defend its southern flank. It's having enough problems right now against the Europeans, right? So if it's fighting both the Europeans and its southern flank is now opened up because Iran is lost, then Russia would be in a lot of trouble. So there's no way that Russia would ever allow Iran to fall without a fight. That's Russia. China gets 50% of its oil from the Middle East. It gets 4% of its oil from Venezuela. So yeah, it lost Venezuela, but does 4% really matter? But if it were to lose the Middle East, 50% of its oil would be gone. China's manufacturing capacity would collapse. It couldn't feed its own people. It needs oil to run its food production facilities. So the idea that China and Russia would just allow Iran to fall without much of a struggle, I find that hard to believe. Basically, if Iran falls, the American empire has won. It now controls the world. It controls the oceans with its navy, and now it controls the heartland, the Eurasia, because it controls the pivot point, Iran. It would control all global trade. But if Iran were to survive, then that's a threat to the U.S. empire, because now what Russia, China, and Iran can do is build a railway network, Belt and Road, North-South corridor, whatever you call it, that would preclude the United States. So Iran really is the pivotal question. And I don't think that Iran is as fragile as people believe it to be. Iran is a huge, huge country. You have lots of different ethnic minorities. There are lots of areas that Iran doesn't even bother governing because really there's no point. So if Mossad is able to infiltrate these areas and establish bases, then Iran would accept that. Remember, during the 12-Day War, Mossad was able to establish bases inside Tehran. It had these apartments, which were these drone-making facilities. So yeah, I think it's easy for Mossad to infiltrate Iran. The problem is that does it have the capacity to actually engage in a sustained war against Iran and survive.
Yeah. Well, Simon, I want to ask you this. This may also bolster your points as well, and that is, one of the common threads between all of these toppled regimes, like Venezuela, well, it hasn't been toppled yet, but you know what I mean. The head of state has been, kidnapped, and they largely seem to be under pressure, under the thumb of the United States now. Syrian regime was toppled last year. Libya, it was toppled 10 years ago. The common thread is that they don't have nukes. You look at North Korea, the big reason, probably the only reason it's still around today, is the fact that it has nukes. Now, one case one may make in the fact that Iran is heavily compromised, or there may be people within power in Iran playing along with the West and so forth, is that they've basically insisted not to build nukes on the basis of this fatwa. That really doesn't make any sense, because just by having a nuke doesn't mean you're necessarily going to use it. You're not going to take the lives of innocent civilians. But having a nuke does provide détente. It does provide mutual assured destruction, nonetheless, whether you actually deep down will use it on civilian infrastructure or not. It does provide détente. So what's the hang up here with Iran on not building a bomb? Is it subversive? Are there subversive elements in Iran that are just using like religious rulings to stop Iran from having protection, to keep the U.S. and Israel and the West at bay here?
Look, Iran is both incredibly weak, but has strategic leverage points and choke points, which is utilizing right now. Historically, it used its proxies in order to gain leverage. But now I think we have an Iran that has already been regime changed. Remember, the helicopter came down. During the last operation, the central bank changed its leadership. I believe Iran allowed for or didn't react to the Hezbollah pager attack and decapitation. I believe that Iran has already abandoned the proxies. That's already happened. They are complying. They've worked with China to build a de-dollarization barter network of flows where oil can flow despite Western sanctions, and it doesn't need dollars in order to clear. So they're important to China's relationship. And at the same time, there has been a union around transnational capital, which is, China sovereign wealth, Gulf sovereign wealth, Norwegian sovereign wealth, and the Western financial industrial complex. They all are in line with the same thing, which required changing what Israel and Iran do. And so now you're witnessing operations to change what Israel and Iran do. And at the end of any tit for tat that we're about to see, which won't be Iraq, it won't lead to Iraq full-blown war. It will just lead to weakening of Iran and Israel. Israel will be burdened with debt as a result of this, which is their debt to GDP went up significantly. That creates dependency where later you can acquire assets. You had port bankruptcies. Basically the Red Sea was shut down. That's causing financial distress in the economy. And essentially, Iran has a very strategic point with the Strait of Hormuz. Now that is effectively what these different choke points in this new multipolar world is what's being negotiated. And so by having a war that looks like we're about to go to World War III, but is highly coordinated, essentially Iran is outsourcing factions of its trimming of IRGC hardliners to Israel. Israel's going to suffer the debt burden. Israel's going to be weaker financially at the end of it, but all are cooperating with the greater powers because Israel has changed its role, which is rather than being military industrial complex destabilization campaign, is moved towards get as much leverage for the financial industrial complex while we negotiate regional stability. And so Israel works for the banks, where historically it had worked for Lockheed Martin before. Iran is cooperating with transnational capital. It is shedding its proxies. And in order to achieve that, I don't think this was all coordinated. I do think there was a currency war waged through sanctions, currency manipulation by transnational capital that created an inflationary cycle, severe economic distress for many. And also they had to prop up much of their power through corruption. And so combine corruption with currency crash, with inflation, then you have an organic bottom up, and then you also have the co-opting through the traditional color revolution. But to me, the greater powers in Iran, they are cooperating, and I think this is part of the cooperation. So I think it will remain internal. They are cooperating with China, cooperating with transnational capital, shedding its proxies, and everybody is on the same page that there will be regional stability in the Middle East, because that's what's needed to usher in all this vast energy, vast artificial intelligence, vast robotics infrastructure. And the China and American power leading up to their meeting in April have already decided what the world looks like. We're not witnessing chaos. We're not witnessing splitting up the world, as greater powers have already agreed. And Trump was installed to execute this. Trump's tariff policy was BlackRock's policy to split the world up. Trump looks like he's making all these spontaneous decisions, but he's fully subordinate to the financial industrial complex. Every policy that Trump does has helped this transnational capital, and the private sector is becoming more and more power, and the state is becoming more and more burdened with debt. So Trump represents that interest. There's mass coordination here, and I think we're witnessing the execution.
Professor, I'm going to ask you the same question. Is there a grand bargain here? Not the same question, but I'm going to piggyback off of the point that Simon is making. Is there a grand bargain here at play secretly under the table? Because when President Trump or the U.S. Military kidnapped Maduro, there wasn't really any pushback, any at all, from China and Russia. We just seized one of their oil tankers, a Russian oil tanker, just a few days ago. No pushback from the Russians. They did launch Oreshniks into Ukraine, into Lviv, though, pretty heavily. But yesterday, Trump was being interviewed, and they asked him, one of the reporters asked him about Taiwan. And they asked him if China was looking to take Taiwan soon. And President Trump replied back by saying, well, that's really up to President Xi, whether he wants to or not. And if he does, then I just won't be happy about it. So it looks like a wink and a nudge to China to just go for it. It seems like a deal may have been made. The U.S. takes Venezuela, China takes Taiwan, maybe even Russia takes Ukraine. Do you see a grand bargain here? Are there signs of a grand bargain?
Right. So let's assume there's a grand bargain where Russia and China respect the Monroe Doctrine, and Trump controls the entire Western Hemisphere. He takes over Canada, he takes over Greenland. Okay, that's what Western Hemisphere. Russia is allowed to steamroll Europe and Ukraine, and it absorbs Ukraine back into Russia, right? China is allowed to take Taiwan. Okay, this sounds great in theory, but let's look what happens in practice. The Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi has said that Taiwan is considered a Japanese strategic interest. What does she mean by that? What she meant by that is that if Taiwan were to be reabsorbed back into China, then China could embargo Japan. Japan depends on most of its oil from the Middle East. It goes through the Strait of Malacca. And so if Taiwan were to be absorbed back into China, China could now just blockade Japan and destroy the Japanese economy. Is Japan going to take that chance? Probably not. So if there's any possibility that China and Taiwan were to sign a reunification agreement, I guarantee you that Japan would invade. It has to be no choice in the matter. If Taiwan were to be returned to China, Japan would face an existential crisis. And the same would be true if Taiwan were to be part of a Japanese alliance. So what Trump is really saying to both Japan and China is, you guys need me. I don't need you guys. Okay? Trying to go invade Taiwan? Go ahead, man. See what happens to you. Okay? So the idea that the United States is going to cede any part of its empire, that it's going to just retreat to Western Hemisphere, is just nonsense. If you look at the national security strategy, it's very explicit that the Western Hemisphere belongs to America. It doesn't care about Europe anymore. And it will challenge China in Africa, and it will work with its allies to contain China in East Asia. Okay, so rather than the United States takes the pivotal role in East Asia, let Japan do it, because Japan has absolutely no choice in the matter. So there's no grand bargain here. It's just pure power politics. And what we're seeing right now is a complete collapse of the national system, where it's every man for himself. The idea that you have these alliances still around aren't going to hold. I mean, it's possible today China's with the United States, tomorrow Japan and China get together and attack the United States. Okay, anything is possible now. It's all up in the air, because right now there's this great rush for resources, especially oil and water. And if you don't plan ahead for the next 10, 20 years, your people could starve. And that's a crisis facing the entire world. Simon's idea makes a bit of a sense, but I want to ask him this question, okay? And it's a really important question for me. What happens if the Al-Aqsa Mosque is destroyed in the next 2 years? What would happen to the Middle East if that were to happen?
That's a great question. Shall I finish off the China thread, and then we'll go to that, and then we'll go to Venezuela? Or, so just so we can move on from the China one. I don't believe that China will hostile take Taiwan. It only works. They're happy with strategic ambiguity. Status quo is what they want. If there were a unification, it would have to be because Taiwanese leadership was either regime changed or wanted it, or something like that.
I completely agree.
But I do believe that the West wants the world to think that it's about to happen, so it can sell more weapons to Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines. But then you've got to look at what the tariff policy did. The tariff policy was a reset of everyone's relationship. And so since the tariff policy, we've essentially seen strategic theatrical divorces all around the world. What we're now seeing is that ever since Liberation Day, April the 2nd, when Trump launched, he said, we're going to liberate essentially he liberated the world from the dollar. So the dollar lost 11% of its value in 2025, which historically is significant, because currencies like Hong Kong and Saudi and many others that peg to the dollar, they now have to sell their treasuries and they have to sell their gold to maintain the peg. They're not going to do that forever. They're not going to drain their gold reserves, but they are going to sell their treasuries. And so now we've had an exodus. So the largest lender to the US government primarily is Cayman Island, which just means BlackRock effectively, because it's not Cayman Island as a sovereign nation. Then it is UK, who's suffering austerity, potential IMF bailout, real estate correction, UK full subordination to BlackRock and Blackstone and financial interests. So it will need to sell those, or maybe it's just so subordinate you can't even make a sovereign decision at the moment. And then you got Japan. Japan has been selling their treasuries, and then we had the breaking of many pillars that prop up the dollar. So you had the petrodollar being strategically weakened with the petro yuan. You had the breaking of the peg by weakening the currency. You had central banks all around the world buying gold. You had the silver operation, where silver essentially did a bit of an embargo. China essentially did a bit of an embargo, even though that was a long-term strategic plan. And at the same time, Japan started hiking its rates for the first time. And that breaks the Japan carry trade. So why is Cayman Islands the number one lender to the US government? Because it borrows those from the Bank of Japan at 0%, and it creates derivatives to hedge out the risks. And so the Japan carry trade is now being strategically weakened. And that's pushed up the price of the long-term debt, JJBs, which means that Japan is going more and more independent and stop being used as a piggy bank for Western financial interest. Then you had the whole national security plan basically saying Europe is no longer important, which breaks the euro dollar. Now, interestingly, throughout this whole thing, the London Stock Exchange stock market has gone up. European stock markets have gone up. The American stock markets has gone up. Venezuelan stock market is through the roof. All stock markets are going up, and the debt is increasing. This means everything's being vassalized into financial industrial complex power, and the countries are being burdened with the debt. And Japan's moving more towards independence, which means that negotiating with BRICS corridors is less important on the American side. And as the dollar gets weaker and weaker and weaker, it means that American exports get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Now, what's going to happen in America at the same time? Well, they're not going to rebuild their manufacturing base. They're going to rebuild their AI and robotics base. So there'll be lots of unemployment and various other things. So I believe that China and America already reached the deal. It was before Trump, and Trump was installed to implement tariff policies to execute. That then leads to a series of theatrical wars that shed all the proxies, resolve the issues. Russia gets half of Ukraine, BlackRock gets the rest. Europe is sacrificed and goes into austerity and distressed acquisition of all assets. The military gets to make up for additional profits. The ECB and the Bank of England get to print another $1 trillion. It props up the US stock market, and we get mass extraction of resources in the West. And the Transnational Capital gets all of those deals and financially aligns these strategic blocks. So I don't think you'll get escalation within Taiwan that leads to economic chaos for absolutely everybody. There's no interest in there. I don't know if you want to comment back on that, and then we can go back to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Venezuela.
Yeah, I completely agree with you about your assessment on Taiwan. I don't think the military conflict will be over Taiwan, but I think there'll be conflict between Japan and China, right? So China has recently considering limiting its rare earth exports to Japan, which is going to force Japan to reestablish supply lines elsewhere. So I think that's the real conflict in East Asia, not between Taiwan and China, but between China and Japan. And that's because both see each other as long-term adversaries, and their history shows that.
Yeah, makes sense. So I think Japan, India, and China are all pushing for their respective new role in this new world order. But I don't think anything escalates into something so bad that it looks like a military conflict. I think they will financially resolve what regions of influence and what sphere of influence and what resources they get to use, rather than going to anything militarity.
Well, I have to say that Japan has a history of militarism. It is a warrior culture. They're very proud of that fact. And Prime Minister Takaichi, with her nationalist rhetoric, has become extremely popular in Japan. So I think it is possible that there's a conflict between Japan and China in the horizon. And I think a lot of it is just that Japan it's dependent on trade for its resources. China is self-sufficient. If America were to embargo China with the first island chain tomorrow, the Chinese will still survive. China will be a lot poorer, but China will still survive. But if China would embargo Japan, then the Japanese would starve to death, and so the Japanese would never ever allow that possibility to arise. So I'm not as optimistic as you about Japan. I think that over the next few years, even possibly over the next few months, you're going to see a lot more conflict between China and Japan.
Actually, I think I want to concede this one to you. Japan's not an area I've thought too much about in terms of military, but it actually makes total sense what you just said, because Japan is kind of in the same situation as Europe, in that it could be what sacrifice. It's traditionally been used as a proxy for Western financial power. It has its own. The difference is it has massive surplus, and so it's not as weak as Europe. And as you said, it also has its own military capacity. So I could see exactly, I think I concede on this one. I could see how Japan and Europe could be where military industrial complex make up for lost profits that they may not have achieved through Middle East and various other conflicts. So I think thinking through it, I think it makes total sense.
Another point I will make is the aging crisis in Japan. It is a huge problem in Japan. So if they wait 10 years, they won't have the population to fight any wars. So it's either they go in now and establish military dominance in Southeast Asia, or they'll just die out in like 10, 20 years' time.
And a huge tell, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. A huge tell is the government is pretty much thrown in the towel. There doesn't seem to be any urgency to solve the aging crisis, the demographics crisis. No one's having kids.
You can't solve it.
I think the government seems to have been resigned to the fact that it's pretty much over.
So what a war would do is galvanize the population, right? Listen, at the end of the day, I think that whoever wins the 21st century is the first nation, wealthy nation, that's able to solve the aging crisis, right? So, look, if Japan were to engage in a war, then millions of their youth would mobilize. And anyone over 80 would basically agree to commit euthanasia. Okay, that's the culture of Japan, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, this makes total sense that Japan and Europe can be proxies for basically having, because of Japan's debt situation, although it has massive trade surpluses and assets, which makes it different to Europe, they can be used as proxies for transnational capital to really gain as much control over assets as possible. So that it just completely fits in with the equation. On the demographic issue, which kind of brings us over to everyone, the demographic issue is an issue everywhere, with the exception of Africa and parts of the Middle East. And so if you look at the highest birth rates right now, it's only Africa that's still having their children, which is why I think that, Africa is a very interesting region, because China dominates, Russia has engaged in proxies. And whenever you see these ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, that's Western interest trying to destabilize. And so there is I'm very bullish in Africa overall if it's able to work with China and European powers and American powers. I think China will give somewhat of a predatory deal, but its track record has been allowing a country to build itself up, obviously subordination and massive tied contracts to have the resources that are needed. But I think Africa might actually, the China model of, we've got the exports, we need the rare earth minerals. We want to diversify away from American debt-led consumption, which is just getting less and less significant. And we also want to build our own internal consumption. But because Chinese people in general, they own their real estate, they have savings. Whenever there's a financial crisis in China, it's not the same as a systemic debt crisis in America, because the Chinese banks are mainly state controlled. So its debt to itself and its population just start eating into its savings rather than the whole credit system imploding. So many people compare PBOC to the Federal Reserve. You can't compare the two. So the debt crisis is less significant, but it's having its impact on internal Chinese consumption. And so building up regions like Africa and the Middle East and actually allowing them for the first time in a millennia to potentially actually use their resources, build their own factories, and utilize their own labor, because they're the only ones that don't have the contracting the diabolical birth rates at the moment. I have more hope that Africa might be way more prosperous in the future and one of the highest growth regions.
Simon, go ahead and answer Professor Jiang's initial question about Al-Aqsa Mosque. What happens if the Israelis blow it up, or someone blows it up?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the linchpin about whether my thesis or your thesis is correct. Because if it turns out Israel does rule the world and they control the purse strings, then they would have the autonomy to rebuild the third temple in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and nothing would happen, and Israel would become more powerful. If I'm right, it won't be allowed to happen because Western financial powers that do control Israel wouldn't allow them to do that unless there was something very strategic. And I don't think it serves regional stability. So it's kind of like the linchpin on who's right around power dynamics. But I don't think Western finance would allow it to happen. But if Israel rules, they'll do it.
So I completely agree with your analysis, and I'll give you some data points, and you can research these data points if you want. But the first data point is that they brought in some red heifers, which is what you need in order to consecrate the grounds for the rebuilding of the third temple. And there's rumors that they've already sacrificed the red heifers. And that's data point number one. Data point number two is the Temple Institute has actually already constructed the third temple brick by brick. And they're just waiting for the time to when the Al-Aqsa Mosque is destroyed so that they can just move the third temple into its proper place. So these are two data points that I've heard. I cannot verify either of this information, but it seems as though they're getting ready.
Yeah, so I think if that were to happen, then Israel's more powerful than my analysis has thought. If it doesn't happen, then I think Israel is a proxy for Western financial power. And that's how I know whether I'm wrong or right on this thesis, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. What I'm a little bit, I can't back any of this up with evidence or data, but I believe that real powers are not like Zionists that are acting out of religious belief. I think they're in a network of power that requires conquering of all resources. And it's somewhat, through Jeffrey Epstein blackmail operations, is somewhat of a reinforcing power structure because everyone's compromised. You can't rise to power unless you're compromised. And so therefore, through these blackmail networks, no one can default from the power. And we're not, for example, seeing the exposing of the Epstein network. The strategic leaks are still being used by power in order to make sure everything's moving in the direction they want it to go by leaking various bits, but never exposing the full picture. So there is a self-reinforcing power structure. I think it is transnational. I think Al-Aqsa Mosque is really the linchpin of this. I think to help us under there is also this transnational global power. I think there's a power struggle within that because historically, military was the basis of the power and it was aligned with a country and it was nationalistic. So the American military industrial complex was nationalistic. Transnational capital is global in nature, so I don't think it aligns with any one country. And I don't think it's run by ideologues that want to bring back the Messiah and are motivated by religion. So what I think they're doing is they're creating a mechanism to make those that believe into the end of time prophecies in both evangelical Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They're reenacting it so that they can galvanize an army to make it look like we're reaching an end of time prophecy, which is a recruitment tool for the various factions of power and army to create a divide and conquer strategy. And so if you're right and Israel rules the world, then they will bring in the end of time prophecy, but the real power won't be doing it for ideological reasons. It will be doing it to create a divide and conquer between those that believe in those end of time prophecies, to create absolute carnage, World War III, and usher in maybe a global central bank digital currency powered by AI and social credit scores. That's kind of that way. Or we're going to multipolarity and we've got strategic interests. These are the two directions the world's going, I think.
Professor Jiang, I want to ask you a question, and I think this is where you and Simon may agree on as well, and that is the end of Pax Americana. What we're seeing today in America, we have these protests that are now popping up over this Minnesota killing of this girl by ICE. And last night we had protests erupt in New York, the West Coast, in Minnesota, all over the place. And then you've got the White House pretty much in, you can be pro ICE, you can be pro deportation, all this stuff, but it was just a very cold response, and they've been very callous about it and everything. It just seems very inhumane over the killing of this lady. And it seems like are they trying to create civil unrest? Is this some sort of dialectic in place? Are they trying to bring about the conditions for martial law? What's going on in your view, as a person from the outside looking in, what's going on internally here in the United States? And then what is this leading to exactly? It seems like President Trump may be setting himself up to cross the Rubicon in some regard, or are we just out of a republic into an empire?
Yep, that's exactly it. So if you look at empires and how they fall, whether it be the Athenian Empire or the Roman Empire, it's a similar pattern where there's internal chaos, and there's military interventionism overseas, and this military interventionism creates a demagogue like Julius Caesar, who is able to seize the imagination of the people and then cross the Rubicon. And that's what we're seeing right now in America, where, Venezuela, it's really about the display of Delta Force. And, all this rhetoric about war ethics and all that. I think Trump's trying to create a military faction that is loyal to him and to him only. In very much the same way that, when Julius Caesar sent his army to Gaul, Gaul was this great plundering campaign which enriched his soldiers who were very poor, and it made these soldiers fanatically loyal to Julius Caesar, which allowed him to cross the Rubicon. So I think that you'll see Trump using special forces more, especially Delta Force, and that builds loyalty to Trump personally. You also see ICE deploy more throughout the United States in order to create all this civil chaos, in order to justify the deployment of the National Guard. Remember, there's this plan to deploy the National Guard in all 50 states this year, and this conflict where ICE agents are battling local residents. That's a perfect pretext for it. I see what happened in Minnesota as a turning point. Something that we should also watch out for over the next few weeks, and I worry about this, is the possibility that Trump pardons Derek Chauvin, who was a police officer who was in prison for basically strangling George Floyd to death, which is what ignited the Black Lives Matter protests during the first Trump term. And why Trump would do that is to basically, give his middle finger to the left, right? And remember, the George Floyd protest it happened in Minnesota as well. So from a theatrical perspective, and Trump loves theatrics, this is something that he would do in order to ignite a civil war. And even if that were to happen, America right now, it's a powder keg, right? Because you have these ICE agents who are basically a hostile force who've been sent in to kidnap members of the community. And these members of the community, these local residents, feel besieged by ICE, who are masked, who are not accountable to anyone, and who are above the law. And so maybe in the future, you will see random shootings of ICE agents on the streets.
It's very odd, Professor, because most people don't know this, but Obama deported 3 million people.
Yeah.
But he didn't make a big stink about it. Like he kept it a hush hush. Like, but they're going out of their way to like it's like they're trying to get the left to do something.
Look, at the end of the day, Trump is a king of chaos. And as an executive, if there's chaos, he can impose martial law by deploying the National Guard. He can declare war against other nations. He can, I mean, there's a lot of power when chaos arises. And so Trump thrives in this sort of environment. He loves all this attention. And like the word that, I mean, like if you just look at like Trump through the first term and the second term, something that he's very consistent on is he tells law enforcement and his soldiers, you have to get rough, okay? Just Google that. Trump saying get rough. And you'll see, like, he's saying this all this time to police officers during the Black Lives Matter protests. And so when you do that, you're creating the conditions for a full-scale civil war, because people don't like being shot at. People don't like to feel as though they're besieged. This is why we have to have the American Revolution. So I'm not sure if it's intentional. I'm not sure if it's part of a larger plan, a larger conspiracy to eventually, move all transnational capital to the GCC or Pax Judeaica, wherever. Okay, but I think the trend is pretty clear. I think that you will see sustained civil conflict throughout America, and again, this is how empires collapse. And as the economy gets worse and worse, as the violence committed by ICE gets worse and worse, then this civil conflict will just get worse and worse.
Simon, your take on the situation in Minnesota and all over the United States?
Yeah, so in this, essentially, the larger operation that I think Transnational Capital want is to shrink America into a regional power, maintain its liquid capital markets, weaken the dollar, and hedge globally, and split the world up into multipolarity. That's what I think the financial industrial complex wants. Under the financial industrial complex, you have two factions of power. Military industrial complex is more nationalistic. It wants to make America great again through brute force and through showing strength, and really tap into the American, we're going to blow them up. We're great. We're the power. Might is right. But then you have a more sinister, which is the technical industrial complex. They want to usher in a social credit score, a digital ID, a central bank digital currency, a stable coin standard. They want everyone to put their Bitcoin in custody. They want to use technology to gain this global network of technological power where they make the media irrelevant because they can control humans through algorithm. And artificial intelligence, and then they can score everybody, and they can essentially take over military through covert operations of cybersecurity and integration into drones, and all of their technology is what they beta tested through Israel. They basically did as a service in Gaza, occupation as a service in West Bank. They did pre-crime in UK, where they were arresting people for social media posts. They did open border, closed borders immigration policy in Europe. They did crowd control through Palantir controlling Hajj in Saudi Arabia. They did integration into drones in Ukraine. And so their technology was beta tested around the world in order to come back home and build a prison state in the West, because they know that civil unrest is how they gain power. They were the net beneficiaries from COVID. They were net beneficiaries from, and so the finance guys were the net beneficiaries from the global financial crisis. The tech guys were the net beneficiaries from COVID. And at the moment, they're subordinate to finance because they still need access to capital. But if you can recreate control grids, then you can control global capital. You can control military. And so there is a power struggle between the real factions of power that finance might become subordinate to technical control grids. And that's a real power. And so if you look at who Trump represents, he needs to use military narrative in order to make the American factions think America's strong. But who does he work for? He works for technical and financial. He was funded by Elon Musk, Bank of New York Mellon, and then the Israeli side is Mariam Edelstein. But his number one backer was Elon. And Elon relies upon Pentagon budgets, deep state integration. He was allowed to buy X by borrowing against his X stock. He got a loan, and he co-invested with Gulf countries. So you can see this this power structure and this power grid and internal conflict. And so Trump is doing what he is meant to do. He is weakening the dollar. And all you need to do is look at all his investments. He's got mass debt to the largest bank in China, ICBC. He's building all his Trump towers in UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. He's got affinity partners that was funded by MBS and ran by Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner is investing in Israeli settlements, buying many Israeli assets, and also bribing Trump to say that you can get a chunk of Gaza if we can get this two-state solution. And so he's satisfying the requirements to move to the next phase of this regional stability, which is what finance wants as well. And so they want to weaken the dollar to reset the world order. Technology wants to take over. And so civil unrest is the perfect way of doing it. So there's all Trump does is he's an agent of chaos because his job is to deconstruct everything that propped up the dollar. When you take out USAID, that was all the covert operations through the National Endowment of Democracy that propped up the dollar. When you wage war with Japan and they start increasing their interest rates, that's taking away the Bank of Japan carry trade. When you wage war on Europe and start saying they're the crazy, then you break the euro dollar. And when you create peace in the Middle East, you break the petrodollar. And so Trump is perfectly executing all of that in the narrative of Make America Great Again, which is causing the civil unrest that's needed in order to usher in the police state and think of 9/11 as a precursor for, the Patriot Act and the wars that they wanted to rage in the Clean Break memo. That's what's happening right now in America. So what they're doing is they're using the algorithms to drive you into the narrative that meets your map of the world. So if you think everything's a Jewish conspiracy, you can go on X, you can go to a space, and you can listen to people that will tell you how everything evil in the world is the Jews. If you believe that it's because Qatar is funding and Muslim Brotherhood are terrorists, then you can go into a space and all day they'll tell you how Qatar funding is all this problem and that the Muslims are about. And then you get Muslim Brotherhood. They're about to do an invasion via ISIS and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda. Basically, if you want to go into the Tucker Carlson, which is more like the white nationalist Christian male narrative, you can go over there. If you like the female Christian nationalists, then you can go over to Candace Owen. If you're more extreme, you can go over to Nick Fuentes. Basically, they're using algorithms and accelerating people into boxes so that you get presented with everything that makes you hate the other faction more. Radical left, right, Muslims, Jews, all that stuff. So the algorithms are really galvanizing civil unrest because they want to usher in a surveillance state and remove the constitution one step at a time.
So I agree with almost everything that Simon said, except on one crucial point. Trump seems as though he is being controlled by these powerful forces, but I think Trump has his own plans. If you just look at his entire career, he's never really worked for anyone. He screwed over everyone he's worked with. So maybe that's a plan, but I think Trump has his own plans. So we'll just see what happens. But I'm betting that this plan blows up in their faces because Trump does not like taking orders. He has a huge ego.
Yeah, if you look at Trump's history, so he was mentored by Roy Cohns, and his family was married into Charles Kushner. Charles Kushner was kind of, Roy Cohns and Charles Kushner were Jeffrey Epstein before Jeffrey Epstein. And so Jared Kushner and his daughter, they were married, and Charles Kushner, if you look at the court documents, he basically blackmailed his brother by hiring a prostitute and agreeing that he was going to release blackmail operations. And Trump had to marry into that family. He made his wealth at New York. If you're in New York, you don't get access to deal flow unless you cooperate with powers. That's the Jewish mob, the Italian mafia, the blackmail operations, and then you get access to capital and the real estate tycoons.
Just really quick, Simon, this was actually posted by the U.S. Department of Labor official Twitter account last night, and it's basically says trust the plan with a silhouette of Trump there, obviously paying homage to the QAnon stuff, but very odd for a government agency to post something like this. I don't know what the meaning behind it is, but
Trump is really galvanizing the Q-tards that think that like Trump is like gonna have be a wild card and come out, and this is just to normalize when everything is chaos. They're normalizing the Trump cult, and that's why I think he was chosen for this role, because he has a cult following. He has the Q-tard psyop. He has the MAGA narrative while the dollar's being weakened. And basically, he can switch every narrative into making it look like this is about making America great again. But if you follow all his money is invested in multipolarity. He's long Bitcoin with his children because he's short the dollar. And so he knows what he's doing. And he is personally, I believe, he's all theatrics, and he's the perfect person for the role. And he's doing everything that he needs to do for the tech powers and the financial powers, and making it look like the military are as powerful as they used to be. And Venezuela was the perfect operation to do that. Like, it requires $200 billion to $400 billion of investment to take advantage of Venezuela's oil. Chevron can't do it. They were already in Venezuela, and they were already selling oil to China. And Maduro had already agreed that the Venezuelan people and there'd be no Venezuelan sovereign wealth fund. And sanctions were just ensuring that the Venezuelan people and the government couldn't get it. And when Maduro went, it's either two things. It's either you agree to this new faction of power that consists of all the powers, Russia, China, and this transnational capital. They agreed what was going to happen. And I don't think there would be much pushback on that. And either Maduro is involved in that, and therefore he coordinated and he's going to get a good deal. He'll be very rich. All his financial flows are figured out. He's got all that Bitcoin and stablecoin wealth from selling the oil via the crypto networks. Or he genuinely didn't consent to what greater powers wanted. And so therefore he was taken out, but under the consent of all regional powers. So this is not confrontational. China, Russia, they would agree to this, and I think they've been negotiating, and they get what they get. I don't think there is a genuine hostile war. There's a competitor between China and American powers, but I think they're agreeing one at a time, and it's not going to end up in World War III.
Professor Jiang, I want to get your comment on what transpired last week with the extraction of Maduro. There does seem to be some deals in place underneath the table. What's your overall prognosis on what's going on with Venezuela? And on top of that, you had President Trump also mention that they're ready for ground attacks on the Mexican cartels as well. So your larger view of things transpiring in South America, how does China figure into all this? Is China willing to depart from its investment in South America here as we look to be securing a Donroe doctrine, so to speak?
So Trump is scheduled to visit China in April. And I think Trump wants a grand bargain with China, meaning that Trump needs China to continue to buy US dollars. So what Trump needs to do before April is stabilize the Western Hemisphere and show the world that the Western Hemisphere belongs to America. And he did that initially with this raid in Venezuela, but he will continue these attacks against Mexico, against Colombia. He will continue to threaten Greenland. He will probably help in the partitioning of Canada. Alberta will eventually vote to succeed from Canada and join the United States. So all this is to show China that America controls the Western Hemisphere. This is important because China relies on the Western Hemisphere for copper, lithium, silver, rare earths that are crucial for the AI industry, for data centers, for batteries, for EV, for robotics. So China has to come to an agreement with America. And I think China will because, look, China had invested billions of dollars into Venezuela. And it really wasn't getting that much from these investments because Venezuela was corrupt. It was being sanctioned by the United States. So if China is able to access more oil in Venezuela under American leadership, then China's perfectly happy to ink a deal. And the idea that America will send in these oil companies like Exxon into Venezuela, as Simon points out, is ridiculous because it's too much of an investment for these American companies. But Chinese companies will do so. And Chinese companies already owed tens of billions of dollars by the Venezuelans anyway, right? So I think a grand bargain will come into place where Chinese companies will go into Venezuela and modernize the oil infrastructure to allow China to extract more oil resources as well as mineral resources from Venezuela. And China will pay the United States the privilege of doing so in US dollars. And this will also hedge against the possibility of a war in the Middle East because China gets 50% of its oil from the Middle East. So if there's a war and the oil and China loses its oil supply, then it can just pivot to the Western Hemisphere to buy more oil from Canada, the United States, and Venezuela. So I think that's the grand strategy here. And I think that China is perfectly happy to go along with this. I don't think the entire Chinese leadership is happy with this because it causes dependency on the United States. But as Simon points out, there is a faction in China that is beholden to transnational capital. They're part of this grand alliance of transnational capital. And they're perfectly happy to go along with this arrangement.
Interesting. Simon, what's your view overall? What we just saw last week with the extraction of Maduro, what's the larger ramification here for South America, China, the US, Russia as well? I mean, Russia has presences in there as well. Pretty much the same. Your response to Professor Jiang's response and your overall take as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Western Hemisphere is a thing and America will dominate and be a regional power, but they're no longer global hegemon. They aren't global hegemon now. They get to exert force that makes them look powerful. But the sacrifice they're making is the dollar. So this becomes really interesting in the April meeting, because if you look at the dollar by DXY, which is a basket of foreign currencies, even the worst of the worst currencies like euros, it's still lost 11% over to that basket. And that basket is dominated by euros. So you can see that this is all about asset stripping by utilizing the government to take on more debt, pumping that value into the stock market while weakening the dollar. And that's exactly what I think this transnational capital are doing right now. And so the government debt goes up, stock markets go up, the price of the dollar relative to foreign currencies gold, Bitcoin, and silver goes down in a gradual transition, just like that 10 to 20 year period between the British Empire and the American Empire. That's what I think is happening. Now, bringing that back to Venezuela, did you want to go through the chart before I cover Venezuela? Or?
No. I was just showing the gold chart just to kind of exemplify your point. Yeah, the gold chart's gone parabolic. Silver's gone even more parabolic. I just looked at the DXY at the start of the screen share here. Where is it at? DXY also looks like it's breaking down below support as well. It's currently at 98. Let's see. Yeah, 90 or 90. It broke through 99, but you can see here, it's broken through. Whoops.
Yeah, it had a bit of strength on the Venezuelan action. The stock market loved Venezuela, including the Venezuelan stock market, which, by the way, is raw. The Venezuelan stock market has just a tight knit of, I'm sure Maduro owned a chunk of it, but it's like a few financial institutions and banks, mainly insulated. So it doesn't benefit the Venezuelan people, but there was a massive pump in the Venezuelan stock market after this action. So all these stock markets are being pumped with government debt, which is historically end of empire territory. So transnational capital will use the dollar for as long as it's useful. It wants to keep the liquidity of the US stock market, and it wants to extract everything out of the American people, the European people, the Canadian people, the Australian people, and the Brits. So they are fully owned by this power structure. And there's no such thing as America first, Britain first, Europe first, Australia first, Canada first, and even Israel first. I think Israel is being put through the same operation of subordination to this capital structure. Now, Venezuela's pretty interesting because what will probably happen is it makes America look great again. It shrinks the world into a regional power. The southern hemisphere, we get more and more operations. But what's actually happening here? Essentially, finance said, Trump, go use the military to get us these resources. And there's no American sovereign wealth fund. There's no Venezuelan sovereign wealth fund. So essentially, the US military industrial complex is becoming a militia, much like Muslim Brotherhood is like a militia. And Muslim Brotherhood is being brought home to destabilize. And the US military is saying, you go get those resources and we'll beta test a model. Now, it's only really Chinese infrastructure that would be able to rebuild the wreck in Venezuela. And then finance needs to fund it, but they're not going to fund it because it's not actually that profitable. So who would fund it? Well, the countries that are sovereign long term and can produce oil at $5 to $10 per barrel. They'll fund it. The Gulf countries will fund it. China infrastructure. America is being used as the military might to go get the resources. And what does America need in order to combat the mass inflation that will be created by repatriating capital and weakening the dollar? There's only three ways to get down inflation. You tax more in order to take money out of the supply. That's not a viable option. You create a deflationary force, which is AI and robotics, which creates unemployment. Or you get the price of oil down. And so when you get the price of oil down, the American oil refiners go bankrupt and transnational capital can acquire them all. Whereas Saudi can still sell oil at that rate and they can finance these operations. And Saudi and the Gulf countries are funded by China. So this is what I think a beta test for this infrastructure of rent the US military, give the assets over to this alliance of the world order, get Gulf money, get financial industrial complex money, and then get China to build and invest in the infrastructure, align all of these assets around that new world order.
So here's a chart of oil, Simon, to make your point. Oil's been in a bear market since the start of the Ukraine war in 2022. We're currently sitting at $59. Now, believe it or not, that's actually up from a couple of days ago. It looks like oil's getting a little bit of a pump here, but if you look at it from a 1-year standpoint, it's down from a year ago. However, if I add on, like, let's say the OIH, the oil services ETF, onto this bad boy, you'll notice. Let me switch it over to a percent scale. So you'll notice that oil in green has pretty much decoupled from the oil service companies. The oil service companies are pumping up to the upside while a lower price, oil is being priced lower. Are these insiders piling into oil ahead of something that they know is coming down that would spike the oil price? What do you make of this disconnect between oil service companies, as well as the price of oil, as well as, you look at even, let's say Exxon. If I pull up Exxon on here, that too's had a record. I mean, it's almost at all-time highs. So that seems to have decoupled as well.
So this is the asset stripping operation. You're decoupling the commodity from the corporate that benefits from the commodity. And so what you're doing is you're using US debt to create inflation and pump it back into the stock market. And then you're handing over, you're basically bankrupting the government, pushing all the value into the stock market, which gives more power to corporate. Corporate then are using lobby to change policy, using deep state to bribe judicial, using Senate to change law, using Congress to get votes. And all politicians are subordinate to corporate power in this structure. And so then you can take the resources, maintain the value in the stock market, but use financial engineering, even though it's not, it's just games, which means that essentially finance are using derivatives, media weaponization, index passive flows, and money printing to prop up the stock market, which is asset stripping the country. So remember, there is no such thing as a stock price anymore. The stock price is dependent upon the ability to roll over the debt to print more money. It is also media manipulation, because nothing's based upon earnings per share or traditional parameters. And that is based upon being geopolitically and strategically important to financial power. Then they control the media. And also the other part of it is, remember, nobody's investing in the stock market anymore. They're giving all their money to BlackRock, all the insurance premiums, all the welfare state, all the pension contributions, all the ETF money. So they're gaining more and more power. They've gone from $12 trillion of assets under management when they were about $1 trillion in the global financial crisis. And so they get to control the index funds. So they can say to someone like Elon Musk, Elon, you do this. And if you don't, we'll send the derivative complex and the hedge fund complex to crash your price. That will affect your stock options. That will affect your inclusion in the S&P 500. And then you don't get access to the index flows. So they're weaponizing finance in order to do full subordination. The government is handing over the power to corporate. Corporate's handing the power over to financial. And then financial's in a power struggle with technical. That's what's happening here.
I see. Professor Jiang, anything you'd like to reply to? If not, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, we covered pretty much all the topics. I know we agreed to about an hour, and we're already over, we're getting close to 2 hours here. So I appreciate you guys being generous with your time. But yeah, anything else? Feel free to respond to anything Simon said. But if there's any other topics that you'd like to discuss that we weren't able to get to, feel free to put them on the table. If not, then closing statements.
Hey, can I say one point before Professor gives his closing statement? We reached a point whether we know who's wrong or right, which is around Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's one other point. If the dollar strengthens, then the professor's right, China and America, and Trump does work for American interest. If the dollar continues to weaken, then it means Trump is subordinate to the financial industrial complex, and China's part of that operation as well. So we can take those two things, a geopolitical event, which is Al-Aqsa Mosque, and a continued every year we can look at the strength of the dollar. If it continues to weaken, then Trump was either unable or was not trying to strengthen the dollar in the first place.
So before closing statements, how about this? How about any other topics that either one of you guys want to get to before we get into closing statements? Or did we cover the...
I'm done. Let the professor share what he wants to think.
No.
What about you, Simon? Anything else you'd like to cover before we take this thing home?
No, I think we did that. But I just want to also say I appreciate the professor's work. I've been watching some of your videos. Congratulations on... a lot of people are talking about your work and you're really igniting a lot of conversations. And Daniel, thank you very much for setting this up. I hope in the comments, lots of people will share their views and will adjust based upon what actually happens. We're just speculating here.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely. Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, no, it's been a great conversation. I've learned a lot because my specialty isn't really economics or finance. So just having a chance to like hear Simon and process what he says has been really enlightening for me. So thank you so much, Simon and Danny. So my concluding remarks is this. I understand the sort of logic that Simon is using to explain what's going on. But I wonder, first of all, are people as rational as Simon believes that they are? That, we're governed by these monetary forces that are rational. I think we sort of discount the role of ego and short-term interests in our calculations. So that's my first point. My second point is that there's always going to be struggles and conflicts within all groups. So even within China, even within the United States, even within transnational groups, you're going to have different factions who want to be the top dog. And these conflicts will never go away because ultimately, at the end of the day, only a few people can win out. Not everyone can win out. That's point number two. And point number three is we don't really appreciate the volatility of the situation in the world right now. Around the world, people are frustrated with the way things are. It seems like the people are just sort of disgusted with the elite. The elite live in their own bubble. During New Year's, like 100 mega yachts converge at St. Bart's Island, right? And they were like 80% of the world's wealth. So the world isn't as rational as I think someone likes to point out. I think there's a lot of volatility. I think there's a lot of conflict. And I think there's a lot of like ego involved in decision making. And I make predictions, but I really can't say ultimately who will triumph in this. But there will be a lot of conflict. There will be a lot of tensions. There'll be a lot of unrest over the next few years. And you can feel the tension in the air already. So that's my concluding remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Professor. Simon, your closing remarks.
Yeah, I'd agree with most of that. Now, I follow financial flows, and by following the money, it's helped me try and get ahead of a few things, but it's certainly not a perfect science. And humans are crazy. There's ideology. There's all sorts of stuff that factor in the equation. I tend to think ideology is weaponized. But, money and power are two forces that I'm able to kind of draw these types of conclusions. And I'd say in game theory, which is not perfect as well, you have different types of games. You have a finite game where you can think very short term based upon a time frame, and an infinite game where you can think much, much longer term. Sovereign countries are able to think much, much longer term because they're playing an infinite game. You can make losses and you can make better decisions because no one can achieve anything in 2 years, 4 years, or 3 months. Corporations, they're in a 3-month game. In order to get their next access to capital, they have to play a 3-month game and be subordinate to capital flows. And democracies, where you have, for example, Trump, he's playing a 4-year game which is condensed into a 2-year game. And now you're going to see every policy that he may have ideologically wanted to do will now kick into what do I need to do to raise the capital for my campaign financing. So you can set up these finite games in order to control and remove much of this ideological stuff. And I think you can see right now that China's playing an infinite game, America's playing a finite game, and corporate interest is all short-term value extraction and asset stripping. And there's no concept of what's right for the people. But if you can play an infinite game, then you invest in your human capital. And at the moment, the West that's controlled by this capital, they're not investing in human capital. They see us as a product. They want us to be debt slaved. They want us to be algorithmic slaves. And sadly, only those that are able to understand the game, accumulate the assets that get them to get ahead of the trend. They're the only ones that will be a part of the elite. And there's no morality in this equation. And once you can get your head around that your government doesn't work for you and understand who the forces are, you understand people's power is not actually in voting, it's actually reallocating your money and investing in your local community, spending in your local community, and buying assets that actually help your community. And that's how you get the ultimate vote, because these powers, they're huge powers, but it all comes down to the micro, your relationship with yourself, your family, your community, and you should use your money in order to support that infrastructure when you can't control this ginormous infrastructure. But you can boycott it. You don't need to invest in it. And that's what I'd say. It's your money that's your power rather than your vote, because the political process is corrupted.
And it seems like that's already happening in a way with these precious metals rallying, with gold and silver. It seems like, at least within the smart money class, I think it may have gone into the retail class as well, but there is a sense in the air that a new system is coming. And so people are running to safety. They're running to a neutral asset like gold, and even silver is becoming more of a monetary metal. I'm looking at the price of silver today. It's back up to over $79 spot. Both metals are rallying. Do you see that? I know we said closing statements, but I can't help but ask. Do you see the rally in precious metals as a sign of that consciousness coming through?
I think gold is a monetary asset. It is a safe haven, and I expect continual strength over the long term, especially in a multipolar world. Silver is somewhat of a geopolitical industrial tool, so expect a lot more volatility, and it's very much dependent upon geopolitical strategic flows. And so it's a very different story to gold, I think, because one move can be made and it can completely change the dynamics of silver, whereas gold is consistently 2% per year for 5,000 years, maintaining its value.
Gotcha. Well, gents, thank you both so much for coming on. Drop us your websites, drop us your socials. Simon, where can people find you?
I respond to everything in real time on X at Simon Dixon Twit. I go live once a week on a Friday where I do This Week in Bitcoin and Tech, This Week in Macro, and This Week in Geopolitics. And all I do is follow the financial flows and monetary flows to try and draw some analysis from it. And then in case I get shut down because I cover some very controversial stuff, as does the professor, I back everything up on simondixon.com. Excellent.
Professor Jiang, how about yourself? Where can people find you?
So I'm primarily on Substack. I have a Substack, Predictive History .substack.com, in which I write about geopolitics. I also have a YouTube channel, and those are the two best places to find me.